So it's Robert Walker here again from the Facebook group Doomsday Debunked, where we fact check the stories that scare you. And I'm talking here about if you've been scared by Extinction Rebellion activists who've come to your school, and if you're a school child, or adults as well who've heard them on television and seen them around and saying these things they've been saying this on television, that our children, and like here we go, I've put some up here somewhere. There he is live on television, and 29 seconds in. So there we are. He said this on television to the UK-wide audience, BBC News, our national news. This was on our national Politics Live, a national politics programme on very popular. BBC is one of this BBC and there's ITV, and BBC is one of this. It hasn't got any ads and it gets lots of viewers. So let's just hear what he says. And this.
Let's move.
So remember, I said before in my other video, I'm just saying, in case some of you come to this straight off, that what these people are saying in Extinction Rebellion is not correct. They say listen to the scientists, but they themselves do not listen to the scientists. They just listen to each other. For instance, the 2025 figure, they just had a chat between each other and said, shall we say 2030, shall we say 2025? Let's say 2025. And then they go and tell everyone that we've got to reach zero emissions by 2025 for no scientific reason. There's no reason for that number. It's not like the 2050 where there is a reason for that number, which is worked out on the amount of zero carbon dioxide emissions to stay within 1.5 C, with a decent chance of staying within 1.5 C. That is often mischaracterized. They don't realize that it is of course it's not exact, but what they really say is that every half degree matters, and that by reaching zero emissions by 2050 instead of 2070, we can knock half a degree off, and it's much better characterized as well below 2 degrees C, because it's not meant to be an exactly 1.5 degrees C, and if you hit 1.6 degrees C you've failed. It's not like that. There's no cliff edge, there's no tipping point if you listen to the real climate scientists. And so they didn't find any tipping points, and this is not them just saying like Extinction Rebellion out of imagination and fantasy. They're saying that because they look very carefully at the science, and there aren't tipping points. I'm going to come up with him telling us that there's a tipping point, and he's wrong, because it's just based on fantasy and very poor research that has not been past peer review. So anyway, so don't take what he says here seriously, and I've explained in the previous. If you haven't seen it, then have a look at least the start of the previous video. If you have come to believe these things, because they're not true. So let's hear him say it.
Move on to Extinction Rebellion. We're on day 2 of a 2-week protest, Rupert, in cities around the world, including here in London. The Prime Minister at a book launch last night described the protesters as bivouac crusties. Is that fair comment?
Well, you know, I'm feeling kind of bad. Here I am. I've got a... You know, I actually know Boris Johnson. I was at college with him at Oxford, and he's actually a lot smarter than he looks.
In case any of you watching from other countries, Boris Johnson is our Prime Minister at present as of writing this.
Likes to let on. And so I've got a message for him. And the message is that this rebellion is about whether or not we have a future, whether or not our children have a future. And when I leave this studio, I will go and read...
So there you are. I mean, I did have any more that I wanted to read. Oh yes, he said that. Yes, I'll do a little bit more. He reiterates this.
Join my...
I'm not saying he's insincere. He clearly believes this. He's a philosopher, and I think philosophers... I mean, I'm sure he's a very good philosopher. I mean, I'm sure he's a purely distinguished philosopher. He knows how to do philosophy. But you don't use philosophical methods on science. It doesn't work. I trained in both mathematics and philosophy, and I did a first degree in philosophy And I did first degree in maths first, got a good first class degree in maths, and then I did a second degree in philosophy way back in the 70s. And I had to basically relearn an awful lot in order to just do philosophy. It's a different way of thinking, so it's no wonder that if you use philosophical thinking in science, and you just try and think philosophically in science, it doesn't really work. I think an awful lot of this may be partly what's going on here. His philosophy is presumably very good, but his science is just not based on science. It's not based on science. It's a different way of thinking.
Fellow rebels right outside this building on Millbank, and the police are arresting us right now. And if they come to take me away, I'm going to show them this, which is, these are my nieces. These are the people that I'm doing this for.
Poppy and Rosie.
Poppy and Rosie, yeah, because I love them.
How old are they?
They're, one of them is about 10 and the other is in her teens, and I'm doing this for them. And if more of us don't do this, we're not going to have a future. That's what it's about. And what I want to say to Boris is...
So, yeah, so there's no doubt he's sincere. I'm not doubting his sincerity. He says that we're not going to have a future. And so, and I've gone through his two facts. I mean, his two facts were that if the UK expands its airports, we won't be able to meet our target of zero emissions by 2050, and the weather will spin out of control. And the other was the bit about crop yields, which I talked last time, about how the UK yields were, okay, our potatoes and onions went down, but our wheat and oats and barley, which are what we produce most of, then we had a bumper crop. And that and in warmer climate, then we expect the UK yields will go up and up. Especially the higher latitudes, they go up even when it's possible, depending on the varieties and conditions and how much they respond. It's possible that the yields keep going up in the tropics as well, but that might involve things like C4 rice, even at quite high temperatures, but which we don't have yet. So there's, but we can certainly feed everyone even through to 2,300. I didn't explain that very properly yesterday, not yesterday, today. I didn't, just a few minutes ago actually, but I didn't explain properly that yes, yeah, that's I never finished the worst case scenario bit. So in the IPCC's worst case scenario, then the worst case is that we return about 2100. We return to the same, instead of continually going forward with our sustainability development goals, to a world in which there's no hunger at all, and everyone has adequate access to healthcare, and everyone has education throughout the entire world. No one, I mean, that is what we have in reach. There's no reason why an advanced civilization should have hunger anywhere, or why an advanced civilization should have anyone who can't get adequate drinking water, who has to drink dirty water. I mean, that's not really, that is not, if we ever meet an alien civilization, then they will probably be, well, they'll probably just say, oh, another, if they meet space civilization, say, oh, another very primitive civilization who hasn't really grown up yet. When they find that we've still got people who are hungry and people who drink dirty water. That's what we've got in the future. There's no reason why we should have that. We've got all the technology, we've got the knowledge, we just got to apply it. So that's the future. If we go to 2100, is a world without any hunger. We can have that by I can't remember the WHO rules. I think it's zero hunger. It's a decade or something. We should have no hunger, and we shouldn't have people dying of diarrhea or childhood diseases. That just shouldn't happen in our world at our stage of technology. So that is the actual risk, is that instead of going forward to a future like that, which is well within reach, and it's not fantasy. I mean, it's like, seems like Star Trek movies, but that is reality. We have the technology to do that. And instead of that, we may find if we do the 3 degrees path that the IPCC gave us an example of their worst case scenario, which is not a target. We are on 2.9 degrees C now. This is not their worst case. Their worst case is where the Paris Agreement falls apart, which it hasn't done, and it doesn't look like it's going to. It falls apart, and then all the way through to around in the 2030s, gradually it becomes clear that an awful lot of quite bad things are happening, like the corals going extinct, and there being more fires in the Amazon because it's getting hotter and drier. You're actually getting fires into the more tropically bits of it. And the Amazon is not all going to go, but in drier conditions, then part of it turns to savanna, but the western part will always remain throughout everything, because that's very wet. So the western Amazon is not going to go, no matter what, unless we actually go down and physically fell it, because fires don't start in tropical rainforests, unlike in California. They're natural in California. They're not in tropical rainforests. So then they go to various. Sorry, I got distracted. So they go to various things, and that go wrong in this scenario, and then it's not a scenario in which we just keep on doing business as usual and producing carbon dioxide and nobody does anything. That is not a credible scenario. It is just not believable that we just, as the entire world, even if we were to dismantle the Paris Agreement now, it's just not credible that from 2030 through to 2100 we keep on producing carbon dioxide emissions and we simply do nothing, and then we just look around and we see all these things happening that they've predicted. So their worst case scenario is that we act too late, in an uncoordinated way, at 2030s to 2050s and through to the end of the century, and we just squeak in at 3 degrees centigrade by 2100. So we are not on that path. If we just keep on going with what we're on 2.9 degrees C by the end of the century, with lots of leeway, that with more action we can stay well within 3 degrees C, and we are already at 2.9. We've gone down a tenth of a degree. The Carbon Action Tracker put it down a tenth of a degree recently. We've had increasing pledges since the last Paris Agreement, and if we get a nice round of increased pledges in 2020, then we can pop it down more, and then again in 2025 and 2030. I'd be surprised if we don't get down to either close to 2 degrees or well below 2 degrees, or even below 2 degrees, with just just normal progress, as it were. But we really want to keep the momentum going to get right down to well below 2 degrees, because that was the surprise in the 2018 report. Not that there's no tipping points, but every half degree matters. And if we can stay well below at about 1.5, then that makes a very significant difference over 2C. But it's a significant difference in terms of, we don't have to build so many seawalls to protect our cities. We don't have, and the very major thing, we don't lose the coral reefs, which hundreds of millions of people depend on for their livelihoods. And the wonderful biodiversity. They do not turn into sponges. They don't turn into a desert, but they become sponge reefs, which are much less, and seaweeds, which are much less productive and don't have these coral reefs are like the tropical rainforest of biodiversity in the seas. And they would turn into something more like the savannas in the tropics, which are still very biodiverse, but not quite a patch on the tropical rainforest. So that's the sort of thing we risk, and the hurricanes and the heat waves and so on, and then when you hear that everyone's going to die of heat, that's not true either, or on any of the paths. Yes, I've got something on that here. I think I forgot to do that. Yes, well. Sorry, I keep saying yes. I think I have slight dyslexia or something. I come up with the wrong words quite often. Have we got deadly heat here? Deadly heat. Yeah, just a very short section on it. Right. So we are currently, oh yes, that was about the billions of people dying. Oh yes, so yes, another thing I've got is the Andrew Neil. I don't think I'll play this. I don't want to get too digressing, but most people, there's been really not very good coverage on TV. We've had sort of wall-to-wall Extinction Rebellion people telling us their ideas, but we have had very little challenging. The main challengers have been politicians and uninformed people. I mean, informed in the case that they clearly read the IPCC reports, which the Extinction Rebellion either didn't read or didn't understand, or are ignoring. And then they challenge them and say, look, and Andrew Neil says that. He challenges her and says, you say billions of people are going to die. Where in the IPCC report? It doesn't say that in the IPCC report. Where is that coming from? And she basically had nothing to answer to that. So they're going around saying billions of people are going to die. And it's not based on anything. They have no sites. No sites at all for their billions of people are going to die. I mean, it's incredible. And it may come, may have come from, there was a thing about, there was an article about deadly heat, which was a misunderstanding of a paper, which said that, which had this, scientists like to redefine ordinary everyday words in specialist ways, because it's very difficult. Like, this deadly heat was defined as a 1 in 10,000 chance of dying if you don't take the proper precautions. Because you can't keep on saying all the way through a paper, and there were 30% who had a 1 in 10,000 chance of dying, didn't take the precautions, and then if it was on the 1.5C, it would be so and so percent of, and then Peter, you have to have some short phrase, and so they redefined deadly heat to mean that, and lethal heat they redefined to mean in the past, ones that already happened, if some people had died. So the 2003 heat waves were lethal heat according to them, because a few people died. That 1 in 10,000 actually did die. But in 2019 there were much less deaths. I haven't actually got the official figures yet. I mean, I tried to find it a little while back and I couldn't find them, just estimates. But we now have a lot of public statements saying, watch out, there's a heat wave, colour coding of the heat waves. I don't think they had that back then. And so there are a lot, and old people were dying in nursing homes, and that's not happening now because they know to be careful in heat waves. So if you do that, then your lethal thing turns into a deadly heat wave, which means ones which were conditions which could have killed some people, but nobody did die. So that was just redefining terms for things people often do in scientific reports. They do it properly. So at the moment, 30% of the population experience heat waves, which they would have called lethal heat because some people died in them. And in the future, at over 50%, if on the path on a 2.4 degrees C rise, increases to over 50%, and on the business as usual, 3/4 of the population. And this was National Geographic did an article which was very misleading. It gave the impression that 3/4 of the world population would die of deadly heat at business as usual. They did not explain that these same figures apply to 30% of the population today, and obviously 30% of the population are not dying today, and that is not what it means. So some people just sort of believe what the Extinction Rebellion say, because they've read these news stories, and as I said in the last video, the journalists go to the press conferences, or in this case probably just read the paper, and they misunderstand it in the case of reading the paper, or goodness knows what, it goes to the thought process, and you almost see them thinking. They ask leading questions, trying to get the scientists to say things. They're not really listening to what the scientists are saying. They're writing clickbait headlines in their mind as they ask the questions. I think some of them, and indeed looking at what they wrote, most of them seem to be thinking more in terms of headlines than actually listening and saying, then what are they actually saying? How can I present this as clearly as possible and as simply as possible to the general public? I think there are very few journalists that go to these press conferences with that attitude. So that's how you get all these alarmist things, because it's now become a shouting match, where, as Lauren said in her video, they 12 years, or is everyone going to be extinct in 6 years, 18 months, 2 months? So they're almost having to compete and shout and say our doomsday is worse than your one, in order to get to the top of the headlines. So that's, I think, was what happened here. So no, it's not billions of people dying. And I told you what happens at different temperatures. For at 4 degrees centigrade, then I've got a paper here, and it looked at what happens at 4 degrees. And in some places, the hottest paddy fields of China, so you can survive very hot conditions in a desert, like the Sahara Desert, the Kalahari Desert, even Death Valley, if you have enough water and a bit of shade and supplies. Then you can survive very, very hot conditions. Even in the Kalahari Desert, then the Bushmen, they survived with very little water, eating roots and so on, but in very hot conditions. Well, but what you can't survive is hot plus moist, because we are developed as, we are savanna creatures originally, savanna plus trees, although we have now spread, and we live cliff faces and caves and shores and mountains and everywhere. But back in Africa, when we decided to start walking, our ancestors did, because we used to go around in trees, and like chimpanzees, there was a lot of trees around, on the ground as well. But then they sort of opened up, and there was a savanna, and there was a great advantage to being able to walk and run. Human beings are amongst the most efficient animal at running. We can't outrun a jaguar over a short period, but we have the stamina. You're like marathon runners, like what's his name? The very famous names just escaped my mind. Not Usain Bolt, but the other one. It'll come back. But you're the famous marathon. Anyway, think of any marathon runner, and they are doing something that very few animals can do. So humans are very good at that endurance, and just going on and on and on. So if we're being chased by a jaguar, then if we've got a little bit of lead and we keep running, then it won't be able to keep up. But over a short period of time, if it runs and pounces, it'll get us. So human beings are excellent in deserts, but we aren't so good in the when there's moist conditions around, because our temperature has to be at a very, very steady temperature, and even if it just goes up a few degrees, we die. We're not like kind of reptiles, which the temperature can go up and down all the time. They go very cold and very warm, and they're able to do that, but we can't. So so at 4 degrees C of warming, then if you're in very moist conditions, which you're not able to sweat, so that was if you're out actually working in the paddy fields, where it's of course very moist because it's covered in water, then at 4 degrees C, then you get to the limit where 6 hours of even a young, fit, healthy farmer in a paddy field, then they wouldn't be able to survive without dying. That's at 4 degrees C. That is well above where we're headed at the moment, even as we are at present. But that doesn't mean that they would have to migrate away from those paddy fields. It just means that they would stay indoors. They would have air conditioning, very probably. Air conditioning make them much more comfortable. But they could even go out in the paddy fields for an hour or two and then come back. They would be rather pushing it, and it'd be a bit risky if they sort of fainted in the paddy field. So probably they wouldn't do that. But it's like the 6 hours. It doesn't mean you can't go out of doors at all. You can't walk through a paddy field on your way to work. But at that point, they might well be migrating away from these hottest areas. And then at 7 degrees C, then it gets to the point where where in the hottest day, in the hottest heat waves, that happens in the Persian Gulf, calling this one. And some of these, I mean, that is fairly recent, that's a little bit older. I couldn't find the very recent one. It's possible that there's more recent things that go into more detail, I just haven't found. But it was 2000, when was it? 2015. Yeah, well, it says 2015 up there, so I assume it's 2015. So, yeah, so that's a little bit old as climate science goes. So it's possible that they've moved a little bit since then, but I mean, that's the best I could find about the point at which you get little pockets where it's literally unable to be able to survive without air conditioning. So that happens at 7 degrees C, and then at 10 degrees C, which I haven't got there, then at 10 degrees C you start having large areas of India. All of this is not possible in our century. 7 degrees and 10 degrees C is off into the next century. Even if we did business as usual, we wouldn't reach as far as 7 degrees. And all the time, as I was talking yesterday, we have the northern latitudes of Europe opening up to agriculture. And at the moment, I mean, for instance, nobody's living permanently nobody's growing crops in Antarctica. And so there are areas of the world at the moment that are almost uninhabitable. And at 10 degrees C, there will be areas that will be uninhabitable for humans, again, somewhat similar to Antarctica. That you need technology, you need air conditioning to live there at 10 degrees C. So people might still be living there at those temperatures, but we're not headed that way. And with that would require business as usual continuing into the next century. There's no way it can even happen, because the way renewables are taking over, which wasn't predicted in 2015, there was no way that they could know how quickly renewables would reduce in cost, and that they would already by now be competitive with the lowest cost fossil fuels. It reduced far faster than anyone expected. So and that's one of the things that are making things look very promising. And and then I've just told you about deadly heat. So that's all the billions of people dying, and it can't be. It's just not true. There's no truth to that, and they haven't produced any science themselves. You ask them, and they just say, well, I'll tell you. I'm going to talk about Jem Bendel's paper here. They tend to refer to Jem Bendel's paper, which is a sociologist, and it never passed peer review. And on Facebook, there are loads and loads of people who are just very strong believers in the believer is very much what it's like. They have faith that Jem Bendel is correct, without having even checked what his sources were. It's a kind of faith. It's a blind faith. A lot of people have a blind faith in this Jem Bendel chappie, and in Rupert Read. And then they go and read all the IPCC reports. Then he has this philosophical reasoning, which some people find convincing, so I'm going to talk about that, to do with the precautionary principle, and why you shouldn't apply the precautionary principle in the way he says. Even though he is an expert on precautionary principle, he is not an expert on science. And the way he applies the precautionary principle would be appropriate if the science worked the way that he thinks it works, but it doesn't. So it's not being applied appropriately here. So the philosophy, I'm sure, is fine and absolutely brilliant. I've no idea. I would be able to read the philosophy papers and myself as well, but I haven't actually. I've looked at a little bit of his work, but haven't really studied it. So, and I certainly wouldn't be kind of prepared to kind of critique it or talk about it on a philosophical level. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'll be talking about on a scientific level. So, because I said I did postgraduate in philosophy and maths, so when I was doing my postgraduate work, I had two supervisors. One was supervising the mathematical side of my work. The other was supervising the philosophical side of my work. Dan Isaacson for the philosophical side, and Robin Gandhi, his supervisor was Alan Turing, for the mathematical logic. So I'm a sort of academic grandchild, as it were. I mean, they think about that a little bit in academia, of Alan Turing and then Robin Gandy and then myself. But then I never got my doctorate for reasons that are rather complicated. So if you go and look at they publish the little genealogies of students, and so if I'd got my doctorate, I would have been there as like the sort of second generation. But no, it wasn't to be. Anyway, so so we don't get the so we don't have people dying, but we might have migrants, but not billions of migrants either. They're up to so now this is from the 2018 report, and this is looking at the indicators 1.5, 2 and 3 degrees C. And so they explained that they can't actually say if people are going to migrate or if they're going to stay in the same place. Because remember, it's only at 4 degrees C, and even then, those paddy field rice farmers, they could stay in the same place. Because it's not impossible for humans to live there. Even at 7 degrees C, then those people in the Persian Gulf, they could say, well, we are supremely confident about our technology. We only need it for the hottest days every decade or so. We will have multiple redundancy. We're not worried about dying at 7 degrees centigrade. And they could stay there, just like people stay in Antarctica. And people often, like for instance, the idea of colonies at the bottom of the sea, and of if we have space colonies, then the space colonies would have that level of confidence in their technology, that much more complicated technology than the technology that we would have to have confidence in to survive at 7 degrees C in the Persian Gulf, which of course is an area that's very high technology already because of all the wealth from the oils. So it doesn't actually, even at 7 degrees C, mean that these people move. So it's hard to predict with migrants because it depends on their conditions and their resources. So if it's very poor, it's much harder to stay if things get very difficult than it is if you're wealthy. And for instance, sea flooding, then that depends on making sea defences. So actually Bangladesh is a very interesting case for that, because they're affected by flooding. I'm not sure if there's something there about that. But maybe I don't know if that was the same. There doesn't seem to be anything there about flooding, so I think they maybe have this separate from the flooding risk. So, because I think this is separate from the flooding risk. So the flooding risk is in Bangladesh. Then they are collaborating with the engineers from the Netherlands, and they are doing the same kind of dike thing that the Netherlands did, but they're doing a different kind of system. Amongst other things, they are trapping the sand and creating artificial islands to form. So as they're losing land, they're actually getting little new islands forming as well. And part of that is because the increased amount of water going down through the rivers to the sea, because of the excess wet melting from the Himalayas, which is continuing for a while. And the excess melting means that for some time, until the Himalayan gases go down a bit, then there's more water in the wet season, although it's drier in the dry season. And so anyway, they've got all sorts of ingenious things. They've got floating islands, but actually it's possible that Bangladesh continues gaining land, although it's one of the top ones for ones that are at risk of losing land. So it's not. I'm saying that because Bangladesh is not an especially wealthy country. It's where the poorest countries go, and but it is actually it's still doing things quite a lot, and it could do an awful lot more with the Green Climate Fund and other funding from outside. Although there's some external funding, but an awful lot of the funding for Bangladesh is coming from Bangladesh. The government itself, a significant part of its GDP, is going towards climate resilience. So that again. So those people still, I think many thousands every day or something. Or lots of people in Bangladesh are moving to the cities because of the flooding of both the rivers and the seas. So that migrance is happening already. But you also have the people who are doing the resilience. And so it's really very hard to predict which is going to happen. Even like in the United States, Florida. So as the sea level rises, there's no problem having the finance for making sea defences. But when it comes to places like Miami, if the sea was to rise very high, like on a 3 degrees C thing, then Miami would there would be, if you have like a metre sea level rise, because the difference between high and low tide isn't very huge for Miami, and the tide, I can't remember the range, but I mean not like it is here in Scotland where it's really quite big. I'm not quite sure why that is. So the ground is porous limestone, so there's no way to keep the sea out permanently in Miami. The Dutch system won't work. You can't have polders in Miami. It just won't work because the sea. Okay, your dikes can keep out the sea, but it'll just go underneath. You can't have. It would be impossible to make a kind of Florida version of the Netherlands, unless you were to kind of have plastic or something underneath the ground all the way of the entire region that you wanted to turn into a polder, or sort of mud, sort of dig, and then put tons and tons and tons, meters thickness of mud to be a kind of water insulating layer below your ground. I mean, it'd be a huge, massive project to make a polder in Florida. So then there's no way they're going to do that. So that even then, so there's projections of many millions of people would be displaced if the sea level rises. But that again depends, because they could follow the example of Venice and stay there and go about in boats. And they could do, and they can sacrifice the ground floor of their buildings at 3 degrees C, and if there was at the upper end of the range, for instance. So you can't even know for sure that Florida is, and then the various ways of kind of slowing down the way the sea goes in, giving lots of area for it to flood into, which means that you can deal with surges more easily. So it's very difficult to predict migrants. So what they looked at is, and remember, these migrants are, for instance, if it's a big country like India or China, most of the migrants are likely to go to another place within India. Because there's never going to be part of India that's going to be too, it's just the very hottest parts, even if you went up to 10 degrees C. I mean, some of the very cold places, obviously, in India, with the presence of the Himalayas. So, and the same for China, some extremely cold places. So anyway, you're talking about possible migrants, and they're saying at 2 degrees C, there's a potential. So they don't say it will happen, for significant population displacement concentrated in the tropics. Tropical populations may, not will, have to move distances greater than 1,000 kilometers if global mean temperatures rise by 2 degrees C, and they would do that not all at once, but for the remaining 70 years. And if it happened very quickly, then, and so that is unpredictable, because it depends on the response of the migrants and how much resilience there is. So if we put a lot of resilience in through the Green Fund, Climate Fund, and through the local people working, and the governments, and if the local governments put a lot of finance into it, then this wouldn't happen. but a disproportionately rapid evacuation could lead to concentration of population in tropical margins and subtropics where densities could increase. And that's not necessarily, that could be in the same country, for instance for India. Densities could increase by 300% or more. So you have 4 times the population as a result of the displacement if you didn't have enough built-in resilience and if the people didn't wanted to move and did kind of try very hard to stay there even with the limited resources they have. So that's why they have it like this. These water stress index, heat wave event exposure, hydroclimate risk to power production, crop yield change, habitat degradation. And then you have the exposed and vulnerable and numbers at each one. So some numbers don't increase so much and some increase much more. Like for instance that crop yield change at 1.5 degrees C in the tropics, they're only talking about 8. I think these are percentages. No. What are these? What is the figure? 2 to 20. No, these are millions. Yes, millions of people, sorry. So crop yield change, there could be 8 million people who are vulnerable to the crop yield change at 1.5 degrees C in the entire world. So that's not an absolutely huge amount, not very much. But at 2 degrees C it could be 81 million, so that's 10 times as much. At 3 degrees C, the crop yield change, but remember this is very uncertain because if we manage to have wonderful varieties of rice, like C4 rice or something, then it wouldn't necessarily happen like this. But we could have 406 million, so getting on for not 40% of a billion at 3 degrees C, and look at the range up to nearly getting close to a billion. There could be a risk of crop yield change, and then having to migrate to somewhere where it's easier to grow their crops. So these are the factors. So heat wave exposure, I mean that's not really a big thing by itself. It's uncomfortable, but they can continue to survive there. But then when you mix in these others, and so when you have 2 indicators, then you have 3 indicators and 4 indicators. So if you look at, say, the 3 indicators, then it's 7 million, 54 million, 237 million. And it's doubles for the 2 indicators. So this is the best they can do, because it doesn't mean that 562 million people are going to migrate at 2 degrees C. Now, the World Health Organization has tried to turn those into a more concrete numbers, but really any attempt to try and give when you hear people giving a number for the number of migrants, then it's always, so far we don't have the sociology to be able to predict what people are going to decide, especially when we don't know what policies the governments are going to have, and we don't know how much effect, how much resilience they're going to be able to build in to things like the climate fund. In fact, I don't think there's any way that you could have more than a range of different projections based on different assumptions unless you knew the future. And then you've got all the individual decisions of the people themselves, because migration is a result of many people making decisions. So that's why it's so hard to predict what's going to happen. So anyway, and I talked about the temperature. So yeah, so anyway, on this basis of no logical reasoning, I think that was I meant that to be part of that. Nothing in the report about billions of people dying. Okay, so you had nothing to answer, and this was about that. And then so that's all the background. Then on this basis of no logical reasoning, she said willing to say to him in the interview that in order to avoid these billions of people dying, which the Extinction Rebellion are predicting based on nothing, that we should stop just about all plane flights. And even though, as he correctly said, plane flights are only a tiny percentage of global emissions. And at the same time, she was saying that we have to listen to the scientists. But she didn't have a single cite to a scientist. And she was clearly not listening to them herself. She didn't explain any of this. She probably didn't even know any of this. So now let's go and look at planes, because that came up there. And that was where I left off at the middle of my last talk. And so I just want to say, like in my last talk, I'm mainly saying this I'm hopeful that some of the people who have listened to the Extinction Rebellion some of the school children might be interested to listen to this and go and listen to the scientists. That's what I hope. And just stop listening to these people. They do not know what they're talking about. When they come to your schools and say all this rubbish, then maybe you should be polite and just let them talk, or maybe answer back and say, what about the IPCC? What is your site? Ask them to try and ask them to give you scientific sites, if you feel comfortable to ask them questions like that. But at any rate, don't pay any attention, don't give any respect to these ideas. You can respect them as people. This Rupert Read, he is a distinguished professor of philosophy. You can learn a lot about him from philosophy, but he is not a climate scientist, and you can't learn climate science from him. Respect his philosophy. Respect his ability to give a speech, which not many can do. Respect his integrity. There's no doubt that he's honest. I think he's honest. From many cues, I haven't seen any sign at all of dishonesty. Respect his integrity. Respect his ability to be so forthright and to work so hard for things he clearly believes and cares for. But don't respect his science, because he is not a scientist, and he is not thinking, he's not working, he's not talking like a scientist. None of them are. So when they come, you could just do not respect the science that these people pretend to be telling you. That's my message, because they are not scientists. Go and listen to the IPCC report, and they're telling it to you all wrong. So, I'm just going to show you, so listen to this. Knowing that, have a listen to what he says, and then I'll talk about it.
Yes. For example, you might have heard that there are plans to expand most of the airports in this country. If those plans go ahead, there is just absolutely no way we can meet our targets under the international climate agreements. And if we don't meet those targets, then our weather is going to carry on spinning out of control. And we're going to have more heat waves, and they're going to be worse, and that's going to go on and on. Henry mentioned that we have a target in this country now to go carbon net zero by 2050. That means...
Now, so I don't know if there was more... that's as far as it wants. So this is the bit I'm going to talk about. So he said that if you expand most of the airports in this country, there's absolutely no way we can meet our targets, and that our weather's going to carry on spinning out of control, and going to have more heat waves, and they're going to get worse, and it's going to go on and on and on. And so, as Andrew Neil correctly said, aviation amounts to 2% of global emissions. The UK provides only a tiny fraction of that 2%. So how is a tiny fraction of 2% going to cause our weather to spin out of control? And then the other thing is that he's not talking about, it is possible to have carbon neutral flying. There are ways for certain flights to be carbon neutral. But they're working on that. And there are actually a fair bit of carbon neutral fuel is already being used in the aviation industry. And the aviation industry is committed to carbon neutral growth. So that's not, that doesn't mean that all of it is carbon neutral, but from 2020 on, there will be no increase in emissions from the aviation industry. Which is quite striking, because the amount of aviation is just going up and up and up. More and more people are flying, as he said, all the time. We need to build these extra improvements to our airports so that people can fly. We don't have to stop people flying. Now, I do respect those like Greta Thunberg that make a personal decision not to fly. As a person, if you want to reduce your own individual carbon dioxide emissions, and if you have to do a lot of flying as part of your work or whatever, if you can reduce the number of flights, for instance by doing 1 flight instead of 2, then and do a video conferencing when you can instead of going to visit someone, then if you are very concerned about your own personal footprint, then that will significantly reduce it. But it's not something that you really have to do, in the sense that it does actually make sense. It may seem strange, but it does make sense to be flying around if that's part of what you need to do, or indeed for your holidays, and at the same time working to recycle, eat less meat, or eat the right kind of meat, less grain-intensive meat, and to get recycled. You look for the right kind of fabric for your clothes, so the right kind of dyes, and even go to all that kind of detail, and make sure that everything you do is climate friendly, and yet still fly around in your planes, if that's what you need for your job, for your work, or if you really need a holiday, you do a stressful job, or you need a break and you need to go away with your kids or something, and you go off to somewhere nice and sunny in a plane, that is consistent, because eventually we're going to have because flights are just a small fraction of the total global warming, and even if you are one of the few that do fly a lot, your flying is not a significant part of the total greenhouse gas emissions. So although it's counterintuitive, then it does actually make sense because you're not on your own. When you're going around and you're in your life, you're eating, like Meatless Mondays is a lot of people doing that in the UK, and the Committee for Climate Change in the UK recommends that we try to aim for 20% less meat by 2050. But it's not such a difficult target to aim for. So you could personally try to aim for that yourself. Or even, as many people are doing, trying to have a meatless day a week. If you belong to family, or you yourself eat meat for every meal, like a lot of people do, as the main meal, try 1 day a week without it. That, according to the science, and this was very recent, just like last year or so, it's become very clear from the science that eating the right kind of meat, so you make sure it's not grain-intensive meat. It's good to have poultry and eggs, poultry, and what's the other one? I think pigs are better, and beef, unless it's sort of on grass in land that would, but a grain-fed beef is amongst the very highest impact on the planet. So you can make these personal decisions, and so the thing is that it's not just you on your own. You plus the other people around you. Some people notice what you're doing, or you affect other people just by doing what you're doing. So you don't need to kind of feel strange and conflicted because you're flying as well as eating less meat, say, if that's what you're doing. And as you say, we're headed towards a future where planes will produce less carbon dioxide emissions, and it's very few global industries that have actually done that. But the aviation industry, as a global industry, is committed to carbon neutral growth in 2020 and cut it to half of 2005 levels by 2050. As the technology improves, maybe they'll be able to improve on that target. But they're already committing on that. And to have half the 2005 levels, not half present day levels, by 2050, then the rest can, if you go and look at the policy for policy for planners, what do they call it? My mind goes blank very easily while I'm talking, but the summary policy, I think it's called the policy for planning makers. In 2018, then if you look at the P1 path, then you'll see that although it goes down near to zero, part of it's offset, and you get people mistaken who've never even looked at the report, saying that we have to use negative carbon emissions, subtracting carbon dioxide from the atmosphere directly in order to reach zero by 2050. Rubbish. That is by, if you look at the report, it says very clearly it's to land use, agriculture and forestry. And so it's just what I was talking about in the last one, about improving the soil, reversing certification, growing more trees, expanding forests, forest expansion and forestation, which is happening everywhere except Africa and South America. And in Brazil, one projection has that by 2025, then they will no longer, there'll be so much, because of the improvements in agriculture, there'll be so much free land that there'll be actually a lot of disused agriculture land, and then they won't need to cut the forestry, even with their increasing yields. So I would be surprised if by the mid-2020s we don't have reforestation in Brazil and with the Amazon myself. What with international pressure and this not too optimistic, it was absolutely straightforward. They used an economic model, and they used middle of the road assumptions about what's going to happen in Brazil. And based on that, then they predicted that deforestation will continue for another 5 years. After that, there'll be so much free land being freed because of the improvements in agriculture, and this is a modest improvement. If there was an all-out program to improve agriculture, it would happen much faster. Because it's only half the... Brazil has only, I think, half the yields of the same land in the United States, and it's much less than the maximum in an experimental station. And for instance, in Brazil, when they cut down the forest, they have the savanna, they have the cows go over it, and then the grass just it's all rather poor quality grass. If it was the States, then they would replant it. They'd plant it with grass seed or whatever. In Brazil, they are too poor to do that. With assistance to the farmers to help them to reseed the grassland, they can have 2 cows where they now have 1. And that obviously would make a huge impact if that was done well over the whole of Brazil. And so this is a projection based on that gradually improving. But if it improved more quickly, then it could free up land more quickly and then stop the deforestation. So when people sort of say to Brazil, you've got to stop deforestation, they're looking at only one side of the problem. We have to do this working together with the local people and do something that is good for them as well as good for the rainforest. So anyway, so I was talking about low carbon fuels made with biofuels, and they can also make it using just renewable power. This is an idea I was reading recently in Australia. They're thinking about making fuel directly from renewables. So they talk about that big problem of how you balance renewables. It's not actually such a big problem because you would do it with hydropower storage, and that's the easiest way to do it. Where you just have for instance, you could a simple one. You have a lake at the top of a cliff, and then you use the sea itself as the other reservoir. Pump the seawater up to the top of the lake when you want to store power, then pump it back to the sea through a generator when you want to generate power. And you get 87% round trip efficiency. And you don't need to dam anything. This has just started. It's very recent. I think it's only one project so far that has done it. That's a very new idea that's just come very recently, is using the sea as one of the 2 reservoirs for pumped hydro storage. But it's very common now to do it with this, and there's another very new one. It's only, I think, one project so far in Australia. This one, then, is to use one of the deep mine shafts of a mine. They've got lots of disused mines in Australia, and the surface or another mine shaft, pump water between the 2. So it's like a battery. So when you've got lots and lots of renewables, then you pump the water up, like when it's very sunny in the day, but then you want to use it at night maybe, then at night, then the water will flow down from the upper shaft, or it will flow down from the lake down into the sea, and so generate the power at night. And then in the day, the sun shines, the solar power produces massive energy, and you pump all the water up to the top of the cliff, and then at night it flows down again and regenerates the electricity, and that would just go on and on and on. So that's one way of balancing the power. But another idea that they're thinking about in Australia, maybe with a mix of it, Australia is one of the best places for solar power. I mean, Sahara obviously, but Australia is high tech, and it's got lots and lots of desert and very few people, and very sunny weather, and they could just cover large areas with solar panels and produce far more renewables than they need, renewable power than they need, and especially with the way the price of solar power panels is going down and down. And it's actually beneficial in the desert, because solar panels in the desert help shade the ground and makes it easier for grass to grow beneath them. It'd be quite expensive to build lots and lots of little roofs to kind of hold, to kind of shade the grass. But if you're building a solar power station that's paying for itself, that's an old area that's actually sort of shading the desert a bit as well. And so it's actually quite beneficial if it's the right kind of desert and it's not a conservation area where there's some problems. And there's no problem with birds hitting solar panels. So if you look at that, the idea is that if they were to have far more power than they need, then that would be another way to deal, but just obviously in places that have abundant sources of renewables, potential for abundant sources of renewables. So some people in Australia are considering the possibility of building far too much renewables to actually give the electricity they need, and then use that to all the power from all that renewables to make fuel, and then export the fuel. So that's a recent idea that's being developed. Loads of ideas being developed. So in that case, if we do start having projects like that around the world, in the very sunny places with lots of renewables, and then especially generating it all locally. So if you're doing it like that for renewables, you don't need to put it through a power grid. You haven't got any of the cost of transmission down to the customer. You only need to transmit as much power as the customer needs, and all the surplus during the day when you've got too much. And obviously you've got to have some transition there. Well, see, at night you'd have the wind power, offshore wind, and in the day you have far too much solar power, and you would use that to make lots and lots of fuel. So this making fuel from, so some of these are already happening, fuel from biofuel, carbon neutral fuel from biofuel, but these ideas, there's also making radiation from renewable power. That's not happening yet, but it is actually already feasible. Audi are already making carbon neutral biodiesel in demonstration plants. There's some examples in Wikipedia, and they get the carbon dioxide from the flue exhaust of power stations. So they're actually offsetting the carbon dioxide from the power station. Now, if that's a qualified one, then you're just reducing the CO2 emissions. But if it is if it's a biofuel powered power station, then you are then it's carbon neutral already, and you're just reusing carbon dioxide from an already carbon neutral power station. If it's organics that's growing again and again every year, like agricultural waste or something, then is agricultural waste like a book like that? Anyway, if it's something that's growing again every year, like trees, and the tree's going to grow up again, and or like sugarcane that grows up again every year, then that's let's think it does again. Of course, agricultural waste work like that as well. Yes. So they're actually getting it just using the carbon dioxide again. There's already the carbon dioxide came from the atmosphere, went into the biofuel. Biofuel gets burned. It would just go straight back to the atmosphere. Instead, it gets turned into fuel, and then it goes back to the atmosphere. It's still carbon neutral if they're using biofuels. You're just sort of doubly using the carbon neutral. So it sounds like science fiction, but make fuel from water, electricity, carbon dioxide, and a few trace amounts of other stuff, and you can make fuel, and Audi are already doing it. And so in the future, as technology improves, then we can expect to have some of that. Let's say Australia is considering the possibility, some people in Australia consider the possibility of going really big on that, on making aviation fuel, or making fuel generally, from renewable power and with water and carbon dioxide and other things. So, say we could use it from biofuel plants. And then there's also research into, let's just play that for a little while. This is running entirely on batteries. It's only 15 seconds. Let's switch the sound off. It's just what Muzak kind of sound. So that's that plane. It's a very tiny plane at present, but that wouldn't have been possible at all before, because batteries have gone way down in price, way up in power density, and they're flying around the airport, just a short flight at the moment, but they can see the way forward. And I think this is Norway, a very quiet battery operated plane, and this leader in electric cars is building this one, and it's to electrify all its short haul flights by 2040. Now, in Norway, with all the small communities and separated by the fjords, they have lots of short-haul flights, so that's quite a lot of aviation. And it's the same, there's another company doing the same in the United States. I think this may be the first to actually have an actual practical plane flying around. I mean, obviously that's just a little small demo, and they've got to go a bit further before they start having it doing, 10, 100 miles or whatever and so on, and then hundreds of miles, and then and with perhaps half a dozen people, but with a lot of flights is actually quite good. They used to have flights from Glasgow to the Isle of Mull, where I live. Once when my granny came to visit my mother, it was by plane, and this was just a little plane. So although it's not like Norway, then it's rather similar. That just a few people in a little plane flying over, and with a flight like that could now be done. Well, not yet, but in the early 2020s, then she could have flown to the Isle of Mull from Glasgow in an electric plane. Or, for instance, I mean, lots of people fly back and forth between Glasgow and London, but I think those are big planes. Whether they would be able to replace them by lots of little ones, I don't know. And eventually, I mean, who knows where this is going to go. I was looking at Bernie Sanders' idea for the States, and one of his plans is to put a lot of money into research into battery technology, which makes sense, I think. I think there's a lot of sense in Bernie Sanders' plan. It's very ambitious, and he says it. I mean, I have to be someone who's an economist. Look at it carefully. And so the Labour Party in the UK, they're putting forward a similar one in their manifesto today. This for our next elections, they're planning to. They have the aim to go carbon zero by 2030. Now, unlike the Extinction Rebellion, say carbon zero by 2025, just made up out of the hat. Just talk to each other and say, oh, we'll go carbon zero by 2025. That is not feasible at all. I mean, that is ridiculous. Because going carbon zero by 2025, then all the cars have to disappear and be replaced by electric ones in 5 years. I mean, can you see that happening? Just because someone decided in a little talk to each other, oh, it'd be nice figure to choose 2025, and if they'd chosen 2030, then you do it by 2030. Just because these activists just sort of said, oh, that'll look good in our posters or whatever, and if they said 2030, they decided to say 2025. And so for that reason, we have to do all that throughout the UK. I mean, I say here that it's deeply undemocratic. I'll come to that at one point. But so that's the 2025. So 2030. So 2030 is more feasible because cars have a lifetime of 15 years. Now, obviously, a lot of the ones we have average, of course, a lot of ones could last on for 30, 40, if you book a vintage one, 50 years or more, but tractors, but enough of them change in sort of like 15 years is quite feasible to start thinking about, and with buyback schemes, to start changing all of them, and by not absolutely everyone, not people forced to do that. Obviously you can't do that, or you shouldn't do that, and that's not the idea. I get some people who worry, say they're very keen on petrol-driven cars, and if you're an enthusiast and you're doing that, I mean, that's like the people who go flying. If it's only a tiny percentage of it, I don't see why people should stop doing their hobbies. And remember that eventually we're going to have carbon neutral fuel, even if we don't have them yet. So I don't think we need to get rid of all petrol. We call it petrol, you call them gas in the US. So so that's petrol-driven cars. But it is feasible with a lifetime of 15 years, and to do it by 2030 is rather fast, but it's not impossible. But it's very, very ambitious to reach carbon zero by 2030. 2050 is much, much easier. Much easier. But on the other hand, these people who advocate for 2030, like Bernie Sanders and in our country Jeremy Corbyn, then I know Bernie Sanders, he gives quite a strong argument. He says this is going to invigorate the economy. And certainly that seems to be evidence that in California they had quite a strong push to renewables, and their GDP is soaring. And they've moved up from the 6th to the 5th if we separated this country as a separate country, it would go up to 5th amongst the UK. It doesn't seem to do any harm. I mean, you get people grumbling about the increased prices in California, but the GDP is going up and up, and and China certainly hasn't done badly out of becoming the kind of world superpower in solar power as a result of investing very strongly in solar power. So there is that. I can see the economic argument there, that actually investing a huge amount. And so, I mean, Bernie Sanders' idea, and maybe we'll do the same in the UK. Who knows if we were to go they've yet to start talking much about their plans. I don't know very much about it, but Bernie Sanders' idea is to have publicly funded power stations, renewables power stations, build lots and lots of them, and then so he would borrow a lot on the future of them selling the electricity and earning lots of money back to the government. And so the government then pays off all its debts that it put into making the renewables, and ends up with in a profit in the end, as would anyone who builds renewables nowadays. If you have the funding to go and build a nice big new renewables power station, then you should be able to earn from that. Well, plenty of people are already. So that's the idea, to borrow from the future, just like a business would, build lots of power stations, and then in the process become one of the world leaders in renewables, so you can export your renewables to other countries. So that's not an impossible thing. It makes sense. Whether they actually get to zero by 2030, certainly significantly ahead of 2050, then this sort of thing is feasible. But what the Extinction Rebellion say of 2025 is absolutely nuts. It's just too short. We also have some brilliant ideas in the UK. That there's the Dogger Bank wind turbines. There's not just UK and Netherlands and some other countries that are around the North Sea. They want to build. This Dogger Bank is where it used to be. It's a very shallow sea, where it used to be actually exposed land during the last ice age and after it, and the human beings used to live there in villages long ago. Before technology, before back when they were all hunter-gatherers, then there were people living in Dogger Bank, but eventually flooded. So if we build lots of wind turbines there, it's out in the sea where there are no mountains or anything. It's very, very steady winds, lots of wind, and that could produce not just for the UK, it could produce huge amounts of wind for Europe. A significant amount of the power requirements of Europe could come from that. So that is something, again, that you could invest in, but not in 5 years. You couldn't complete that in 5 years and sort of, to say, we've got to rush and build this in 5 years. We've got to complete it, and we've got to actually producing power by 2025. I mean, you've got to start off small and build up and do things to scale. So, and do it properly. So it's great. Zero emission by 2050 is what we aim for 1.5 degrees C. Every half degree counts. Means that even the half degree between now and 1.5 degrees C, now they didn't estimate that in the 2018 report. But they did in a way. They look at the difference between now and 1.5. I just showed you. So in a way, I mean, look, even if you could stay at 1.5, in a way, you could say they did estimate, because they compared the present with 1.5. Can I see it? Those figures, I showed you the migrants. There we are. No, yes, the 1.5 increase up to 1.5. That's 8 million people. The two factors, two indicators, 203 million people. So if we can stay to 1 degree C, then we save 203 million people from having two factors, and 7 million for three factors. Still 7 million people, even one person is one person, and there's still obviously a significant amount already happening at 1.5 degrees C. And crop yield change, then there's 8 million people affected already. Habitat degradation, 10 million people at 1.5 degrees C. So if you can stay within 1.5 degrees C, then we can make it much easier for these people. And so the thing is that we could go all the way up to 3 degrees C, 4 degrees C, 5 degrees C if it was spread out over, say, 1,000 years or a couple of hundred years. The real problem is doing it so quickly. That's why so many people are affected. Over 1,000 years, if your grandchildren live in a different place from where you live, who's going to care? I mean, people do move around from one generation to the next. So this whole migrant thing isn't really a big issue if it was slower. And then you would have more people living up in Alaska and Canada and Russia, and fewer people maybe in the tropics, or maybe you have more people in the tropics because maybe they find ways to adapt in plants that grow and so on. So it's really the speed that's the problem. Now let's go back to our planes thing. So anyway, I think I finished the planes, and I think I'll take another little break, and then then I can have a separate one about this whole deep adaptation thing, and his it's hard to think. I can't really say polite words about this, and in fact I was so this word that we use in English, and in England it's not an impolite word, but I understand you hear people saying it on the TV all the time, but in the United States I understand that we can see it sound quite vulgar, but we just say it, and it's just a normal word for us. So for me it's quite easy to say, and it's not a vulgar word at all. Then deep adaptation is bullshit. That's what it is, bullshit. Somewhat more polite word, crap. So I'll talk about this next time.